Welcome back to Work Talk Unfiltered, the podcast where we explore real conversations for real-world communication. I'm Alex.
And I'm Jamie, and today we're diving into, the high-stakes environment of job interviews, specifically how chasing that quote-unquote perfect answer often completely ruins your chances, and why just natural communication almost always wins.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about it. Have you ever walked out of an interview and realized that, the harder you tried to sound smart, the more incompetent you actually look to the person across the table?
Oh, definitely. It's the worst.
Right. You get into your car or you log off the video call and the adrenaline just starts to fade. And it leaves you with this sinking feeling that you didn't even sound like yourself.
You just sound like a robot.
Exactly. Instead of projecting authority, you just deliver this heavily rehearsed robotic monologue. So today, we are going to unpack the underlying mechanics of, why that happens, and more importantly, how to actually fix it.
It is such a universally frustrating phenomenon. I mean, you spend hours preparing, you meticulously organize your whole career history into these optimized bullet points.
The perfect resume.
Right, exactly. And yet, the actual event feels entirely disconnected from who you are as the professional. The interaction just, I don't know, it loses its humanity.
Okay, let's unpack this by setting the scene a bit. I want you to picture the candidate sitting in the interview chair. It's one of those sleek, glass-walled conference rooms.
Oh, yeah, where everyone walking by can just stare at you.
Yes. And the air conditioning is cranked just a little too high. You're holding this glass of ice water that's actively sweating onto a mahogany table. The tension is just palpable.
Your cortisol levels are rising. The whole fight or flight response is quietly booting up in the background.
And right at the peak of that physiological spike, the interviewer looks up from your resume, smiles, and drops the classic inevitable opener. So tell me about yourself.
The most predictable question in the corporate world.
Right. Yet the one that consistently derails incredibly qualified candidates, the reaction is almost visceral. Like, you can physically see the candidate stiffen.
They just completely freeze up.
Yeah, their shoulders hike up toward their ears, and they launch into this sprawling, chronologically exhaustive life story.
Starting all the way back with their undergrad degree.
Yes. They mention every lateral career move, every minor project, and they pad this whole monologue with these long, overly complicated sentences in just a desperate attempt to sound professional.
Well, they fall into the trap of over-explaining, and the immediate fallout of that is pretty severe.
It really is.
Because instead of sounding highly qualified, they sound unnatural, rehearsed, and ironically deeply unsure of themselves.
When I observe people using those convoluted, jargon-heavy sentences in a high-stakes environment, I always think of it kind of like watching someone wear a designer suit that is just 3 sizes too big.
Oh, that is a great analogy.
Right. Like, they bought it because it has a fancy label. They think, this is professional, this is high-end. But because the suit absolutely swallows them whole, they just look incredibly uncomfortable in their own skin.
Totally. They're drowning in it.
Exactly. They're tripping over the hem, the sleeves are past their hands. The interviewer isn't even looking at the candidate's skills anymore. Their brain is spending all its energy just trying to figure out why the suit doesn't fit. You're essentially creating a cognitive roadblock with your own vocabulary.
Which perfectly illustrates what happens on a neurological level, actually. When you use those artificially complex sentences with, multiple dependent clauses and heavy corporate buzzwords, you are actually maxing out the interviewer's working memory.
Wait, really? Just from the vocabulary?
Yeah. The average human brain can only hold a handful of new pieces of information at once. So if you force the interviewer to decipher your syntax in real time, the actual meaning of what you are saying just gets entirely dropped. The connection is severed.
Which raises the question, I guess, why do we do it? If we know normal human conversation is more effective, why do our brains immediately default to the robotic script?
It comes down to how adrenaline hijacks the brain. When you enter that glass-walled room, your amygdala, the threat detection center, it perceives the evaluation as a literal physical danger.
The old fight-or-flight response.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It triggers an adrenaline release, which impairs your prefrontal cortex. And that is the part of your brain responsible for complex thought, nuanced vocabulary, and natural conversational rhythm.
So we literally lose access to our actual expertise in that exact moment.
We do, because the higher order thinking is temporarily clouded. We just panic grab for whatever is most accessible. possible. Usually that means falling back on rehearsed business cliches or like trying to sound like a textbook.
Because our brain thinks mimicking a textbook equals safety.
Right. We treat the interaction like an oral exam in graduate school, completely missing the point.
Yeah.
Real interview communication is not a vocabulary test.
They certainly aren't grading anyone on their use of the word synergy.
No, definitely not. If we look at the underlying psychology, that illusion of formal perfection actually signals insecurity to the listener.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, when a candidate uses simple, direct language, they project a high degree of authority. They are essentially communicating, I know my inherent value, and I do not need to dress it up in $50 words for you to recognize it.
That brings up a crucial pivot, I think, especially regarding that opening "tell me about yourself" question. We established that the chronologically exhaustive life story is a massive mistake.
A huge mistake.
But I want to push past the basic advice here. Like, we know we shouldn't recite our high school achievements, but I see high-level executives, directors, VPs stumble here because they feel this intense pressure to validate their entire 20-year career arc in just 3 minutes.
The instinct to comprehensively prove your worth immediately is incredibly strong. But the candidates who consistently secure offers, they operate on a completely different paradigm. They understand that the introduction isn't about giving a comprehensive history at all. It is an exercise in structure and narrative framing.
So they shrink the suit so it actually fits the specific occasion.
Exactly. They utilize a highly engineered three-part narrative structure: past foundation, current value, and future alignment.
Okay, past, present, future.
Right. The human brain craves narrative schema. When you provide a predictable, logical structure, the interviewer's brain just doesn't have to work as hard to understand you, which subconsciously makes them like you more.
Let's break down the mechanics of that three-part structure. Step 1 is the brief background.
Yes, the keyword being brief. This is just setting the foundation. You could say, I've spent the last 6 years in digital marketing focusing heavily on predictive data analytics and enterprise-level campaign strategy.
Okay, so you're just establishing the landscape.
Exactly. You do not need to list the agencies you worked for or the software you used unless it is hyper-relevant to the immediate role.
So if the background just sets the broad foundation, how do you prove you can actually solve their problems today without sounding like you are just listing resume bullet points?
That transitions directly into step 2, your current role or immediate focus. You ground the listener in your present-day capabilities.
Give me an example of that.
Sure. Currently, I'm directing a team of 12 where we recently automated the client onboarding architecture, reducing churn by 15%. It demonstrates action and velocity. It shows them who you are today, not just where you came from.
Okay, so background sets the stage. Current role demonstrates the velocity. But it still feels a little incomplete. If I stop there, I'm just talking about myself in a vacuum.
Which is exactly why step 3 is the linchpin of the entire framework. You have to build a definitive bridge between your past and their future.
Because the interviewer is really just focused on their own problems.
100%. You must frame your history through the lens of their current organizational needs.
How does that actually sound in practice?
You conclude the introduction by explicitly making that connection. And that is specifically why I was drawn to the senior strategist role with your organization. I see a direct opportunity to leverage my background in predictive analytics and my current team building experience to help scale your upcoming fourth quarter initiatives.
Oh, wow, yeah. That structure entirely shifts the dynamic of the room.
It really does.
You stop being a subject waiting to be evaluated, and you immediately position yourself as a peer ready to collaborate. You gave them a clean narrative, reduced their cognitive load, and teed up the rest of the conversation around the exact problems they need solved.
And notice the deliberate absence of convoluted jargon in that example. The power comes from the clarity of the timeline, not the complexity of the vocabulary.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. A three-part structural framework is fantastic when you actually know the question is coming.
Right, when you can prepare for it.
Yeah, we can all rehearse the "tell me about yourself" bridge. But what happens when you get a total curveball? Say they ask about a highly specific technical failure you've experienced, or a hypothetical market shift you haven't even considered.
That is where people really panic.
My immediate visceral instinct is to talk. Like, if I pause for 5 seconds, won't the interviewer just assume I have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about? There's a very fine line between a thoughtful pause and a terrified blank stare.
What's fascinating here is how our perception of time drastically alters under stress. Because your adrenaline is spiking, a 3-second pause feels like 3 hours to you. Your internal clock is racing.
Yeah, it feels like an eternity.
But to the listener whose heart rate is completely normal, a 3-second pause barely registers as a delay. It just reads as a natural, thoughtful breath.
But the internal pressure to just invent the perfect answer on the fly while my mouth is already moving is overwhelming. I start building a bridge while I'm walking on it, and it usually collapses halfway across the chasm.
Yielding to that pressure to invent an immediate answer is actually the most damaging thing you can do for your perceived authority.
Really?
Yes, it brings us to the psychology of status in professional environments. High-status individuals, people who are deeply confident in their expertise, they do not rush to appease. They tolerate silence.
That makes a lot of sense.
They feel entirely comfortable making others wait a few moments for a considered response. When you instantly start rambling to fill the void, you are signaling lower status. You are letting anxiety dictate the pacing.
By rushing, you are essentially signaling that you are afraid of losing their attention. So how do we physically manage that terrifying silence without it looking like our brain just short-circuited?
The mechanism requires a deliberate, counterintuitive physiological reset. When the curveball hits, stop. Close your mouth, take a deep, intentional breath.
Just force yourself to breathe.
Exactly. This physically engages the vagus nerve, which activates your parasympathetic nervous system and literally slows your heart rate down. Then, acknowledge the question out loud to buy yourself another second.
Like saying, that's a tough one.
Something like, that is an incredibly complex scenario. Let me think about the best way to approach that.
Ah, okay. So acknowledging it out loud bridges the silence.
Yeah.
It shows you are engaged with the difficulty of the premise, rather than just stunned by it.
It demonstrates real-time problem solving. Think about it. If a major client throws an unexpected crisis at you during a high-stakes meeting, the company does not want a leader who starts babbling defensive nonsense.
Right, they want someone who can stay calm.
They want someone who can halt the momentum, process the new variables, and formulate a coherent response. The interview curveball is just a simulation of that exact workplace pressure.
And what if you genuinely do not have the technical answer after that pause?
Authenticity will always outperform a panicked fabrication. You state clearly what you know, acknowledge the gap in your specific knowledge, and immediately pivot to your methodology for finding the solution.
Okay, pivot to the methodology.
Yeah, you say, I haven't worked directly with that specific integration, but based on my experience with similar architecture, my first step would be to isolate the API endpoints. The structure of your thinking is usually way more important to them than the immediate factual trivia.
So what does this all mean for the listener tomorrow morning? If someone is sitting in their car doing some deep breathing, waiting to walk into the corporate lobby, what are the actual physical mechanics they need to focus on?
Delivery is everything.
Right. We've explored the cognitive load and the narrative theory.
Yeah.
But how do we physically manifest this natural confidence?
The mechanics of delivery are paramount because confidence is heavily derived from the acoustic properties of how something is said, far more than the transcript of what is said.
Interesting.
A candidate could possess the most perfectly engineered 3-part narrative structure in the world, but if their delivery is frantic and thin, the expertise is entirely lost.
The oversized suit returns to hide the value underneath.
Precisely. To physically manifest authority, you must focus on the triad of delivery: tone, pacing, and intentional pauses.
Let's analyze the first one. Tone. When the fight or flight response kicks in, I know my voice tends to pitch up. It gets a little breathy and strained.
That is a biological response. Stress causes the vocal cords to tighten and the breathing to become shallower, originating from the upper chest. A thin, high-pitched tone subconsciously signals distress to the listener's brain.
So how do we fix it?
To project authority, you need resonance. This requires conscious, diaphragmatic breathing. By pulling air deeper into your lungs, you relax the vocal cords and produce a steadier, lower tone. A steady, resonant tone naturally commands the room and signals that you are not under threat.
Combine that steady tone with the simple, direct language we discussed earlier, and the effect must be incredibly grounding.
It is the ultimate antidote to the panic ramble. It forces the brain to slow down and articulate thoughts clearly. Which brings us directly to the second mechanic: pacing.
Pacing is my personal hurdle. When the spotlight hits, I become a speed talker. The internal monologue is just saying, get all the data out before they interrupt you or lose interest.
Which is a very common manifestation of the lower status signaling we explored earlier. Rushing implies your time is less valuable than theirs.
Wow. Yeah.
From a cognitive perspective, rapid-fire delivery is a disaster for the interviewer's comprehension. Think of your career achievements like a meticulously prepared 5-course tasting menu.
Okay, I like this. If I rush the delivery, it's like dumping all 5 courses onto a single plate and blending them together.
Exactly.
The ingredients might be Michelin star quality, but the resulting presentation is completely unpalatable. The interviewer can't distinguish the leadership skills from the technical expertise.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. The interviewer is hearing this dense, complex information for the very first time. Their brain needs a fraction of a second to encode each achievement into memory.
So you have to slow down.
Good pacing means speaking just slightly slower than your adrenaline is telling you to. You have to give the listener's brain time to digest the first course before you serve the second.
And the mechanism we use to separate those courses is the third part of the triad, the intentional pause.
The deliberate use of silence is the hallmark of a master communicator. We discussed the pause for managing a curveball, but it applies to the standard flow of the conversation as well. You pause briefly between sentences.
Just to let it sink in.
Yeah, you pause after delivering a particularly strong metric or insight to allow the impact to land.
It takes immense discipline to let a powerful statement just hang in the air for a second without immediately rushing to qualify it or add another caveat.
It really does. But utilizing intentional pauses demonstrates profound comfort in the space. It physically proves you are not rushing to escape the spotlight. It all circles back to the core premise. You are engaging in a genuine human interaction, not a theatrical performance.
Right.
When you speak with a respected colleague, you naturally pause. You don't rush. You use accessible language.
You allow the ideas to breathe. And that natural, unforced communication is exactly what builds the connection, bypassing the artificial formality that ruins so many interviews.
When you strip away the oversized suit of jargon, the frantic pacing, and the desperate need to prove your entire life's worth in 5 minutes, what remains is the actual professional they want to hire.
To crystallize this, for everyone preparing for their next big conversation, let's just quickly distill the mechanics. First, abandon the illusion of formal perfection. Complex jargon increases cognitive load and severs connection. Speak simply to project authority.
Second, engineer your introduction. Move past the chronological life story and utilize the narrative schema. Lay the background foundation. Demonstrate your current value and velocity, and critically, build the bridge to their specific future needs.
Third, reframe your relationship with silence. When the curveball hits, do not let adrenaline dictate your pacing. Engage the parasympathetic nervous system with a breath, acknowledge the question, and take the high-status pause to formulate your structure.
Finally, master the triad of delivery. Utilize diaphragmatic breathing for a resonant tone, slow your pacing to allow the listener to digest your value, and deploy intentional pauses to let your strongest points land.
I love that. I want to leave you with one final fundamental paradigm shift to consider before you walk into that glass-walled room. We place an immense, crushing burden on ourselves to deliver the absolute right academic answer to every single question. But what if the person across the table isn't actually looking for a textbook answer at all?
That alters the entire objective of the interaction.
Exactly. What if they were simply testing to see what it would organically feel like to sit next to you at a desk, collaborating on a stressful project for 40 hours a week? If you walked into that room treating the interviewer as a future collaborator trying to solve a puzzle with you, rather than a judge waiting to strike a gavel, how would your posture, your pacing, and your entire psychological approach transform?
It changes the entire emotional architecture of the room. You stop performing out of fear and you begin connecting out of shared purpose.
The ultimate goal isn't to survive the interrogation. It is to start the collaboration. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into natural communication. We'll catch you on the next episode of Work Talk Unfiltered.
See you next time.